we will go ahead and get started. So a final thank you for joining us today, and hopefully you are having some wonderful weather this afternoon. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to note that the views expressed in written conference materials or publications and by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsements by the U.S. government. Next slide, please. My name is Mackenzie Simmons, and I have the privilege of serving as the project manager for SAMHSA's 988 Crisis Systems Response Training and Technical Assistance Center that's operated by Altarum. Before we begin, we wanted to provide a reminder that should you need further assistance, the CSR-TTAC staff will be available for office hours immediately following the conclusion of this webinar from 3:30 to 4 to assist with coordinating efforts for further implementation, including arranging meetings for individualized TA with those participants looking for more robust one-on-one assistance. Now, we're going to take a moment to ensure that everyone in the audience is ready and comfortable with the technical aspects of this webinar. I'll now turn things over to my colleague Olivia to walk you through the webinar interface, including how to submit questions and other technical information.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. As you'll see, closed captioning is enabled for today's webinar. We also have live translation and ASL capabilities, so our ASL interpreters will be pinned on the screen there. If you need additional tech support during today's webinar, please use the Q&A function and I will help to address that for you. Lastly, if you have any questions during the presentation for our presenters, please also put them into the Q&A function there and we will get them addressed. They'll be sent directly to us. Please note, we will not be monitoring the chat for questions.
Thanks, Olivia. Before we start our presentation portion, I'd like to introduce one of our guest speakers. Carissa Pallas is the Director of Communications for the 988 in Behavioral Health Crisis Coordinating Office at SAMHSA. As the Director of Communications, she leads all 988 communication strategies, including content and campaigns targeting public audiences, strategic partners, and the media. Pallas is a communications strategist with more than a decade of leadership experience in strategic planning, crisis communications, reputation management, and team building. At this time, I will pass things over to her to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. With the nationwide transition to 988, which was nearly 2 years ago now, as the 3-digit number for 24/7 support for anyone experiencing a mental health or substance use crisis or emotional distress, the need arose for 988 specific formative research among groups that have been put at higher risk for or are disproportionately impacted by suicide. The 988 Formative Research Project began in summer of 2022 as a collaborative effort led by the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, or the Action Alliance, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, and the Ad Council Research Institute, supported by SAMHSA. The 988 Formative Research Project fills a critical research gap and supports more informed 988 messaging and implementation efforts. The project, which has been divided into 2 phases, was conducted to uncover knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions about accessing crisis services among populations at higher risk for or disproportionately impacted by suicide, to identify and explore barriers and motivators to accessing crisis services among these populations, to inform and culturally sensitive, responsive, and effective messaging development to help individuals across 988 in times of crisis, and to identify trusted messengers that population groups turn to when facing difficult mental health challenges. Phase 1, the results of which were released last November, focused on American Indian and Alaska Natives ages 13 to 34 Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, ages 13 to 34, Black and youth and young adults, ages 13 to 34, Hispanic youth and young adults, ages 13 to 34, individuals who have attempted suicide or experienced suicidal ideation during their lifetime, ages 13 plus, LGBTQIA plus youth and young adults, ages 13 to 34, people with disabilities, ages 13 and over, and also rural older men, ages 49 plus. Phase 2 of the formative research, the results of which will be announced this week and will be talked about today, focuses on diving deeper into trusted messengers, mothers, siblings, spouses, partners, and friends of phase 1 audiences to determine how to better support these individuals in messaging about 988 and suicide prevention. Now let's get to the reason we're all here today. Today, I'm joined by Derek Feldman, who is the Managing Director of the Ad Council Research Institute and is recognized as a leading researcher on social issues, movements, and consumer public action. His primary body of research focuses on large-scale quantitative and qualitative methods to provide insights on consumer and public knowledge, as well as attitudes and behaviors on social issues. Feldman produces nearly 24 studies a year and has built an impressive body of research and insights into how and why the public takes action for change. Liz Fox is a strategic communications expert with more than a decade of experience planning and directing health communications campaigns for federal and state government, nonprofit, and private sector organizations. She currently serves as the project director for the 988 Formative Research Project, a collaborative project that I just mentioned between SAMHSA, SPRC, and Action Alliance, which is why we're all here today. And at this time, I will hand things over to Liz to get us started.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate that. And I did want to just acknowledge, if you can go back one slide, one very important person who was not able to make it today due to some weather challenges and travel snafus is Shelby Rowe, who is the executive director of SPRC. And without her and her team's involvement, this project would not have turned out to be what it is, and namely because of their strong commitment to the infusion of lived experience, suicide-centered lived experience throughout the entire process. And so unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here with us here today, but we would be remiss if we didn't honor her and her team's contribution to this work. Next slide, please. So Carissa just gave a great overview of the 988 Formative Research Project, what it is. Just as a quick reminder, this is really, formative research in general is how we as communicators or program developers, public health practitioners really get to a better understanding of our key audiences. And in this case, it's what we use to understand the knowledge, the attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, motivators, barriers around key audiences that would help us eventually figure out how to craft and support culturally sensitive, responsive, effective, and ultimately successful communications about 988. And the findings that you'll hear more about from Derek in just a minute, these are really insights that help us make informed decisions about how we can use communications to raise awareness and also instill trust in 988 for populations that are disproportionately impacted by suicide, as well as their trusted messengers. And I think personally, one of the greatest benefits of the formative research that we've done are evidence-based message frames. And these can be used to be further tested, validated, enhanced, tailored, make them fit the populations that you are trying to serve. And if this sounds like you've heard it before, you probably have, as Carissa mentioned. We released some really exciting research in November of last year that focused specifically on 8 populations disproportionately impacted by suicide. And as part of that research, we asked them, who are their trusted messengers? You can see the findings from that research at the QR code that will take you straight to our website link. Right now, it has the findings from last year's study, that first initial study, but we are so excited that tomorrow you will be able to access the findings for the current study that we're talking about, which is, go to the next slide, please, all about trusted messengers. And so trusted messengers, using a definition that our partners at Ad Council have been using and have studied for a long time. Trusted messengers are those individuals who people turn to for trusted, unbiased information and help when they're struggling with their mental health or in crisis. And so in our first study, we asked our populations, who are these people to you? Who are they? And they gave us a number of answers. But the 4 groups that really rang true across those 8 populations were the ones that you see on the slide: mothers/caregivers, spouses/partners, siblings, and friends. And so Derek will talk more about the methodology, but we were able to conduct a very robust mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative study specifically among trusted messengers to those populations disproportionately impacted by suicide. Next slide, please. And so, like with our first study, we have a number of resources that will be available, again, beginning tomorrow. We have a comprehensive report and executive summary that describes the study findings and goes into a lot of detail about what we found. But we also have a toolkit for how to take those insights and put them into action. There's strategic insights for communicators to help you craft and test your tailored messages and campaigns from that trusted messenger lens. And then coming soon, we will have a research protocol which very clearly outlines and defines every step of the research process. For any researchers who are joining us today, this will be most interesting to you, where you can see all of the research instruments that were used, the process, the details about the methodology. And so again, all of this available tomorrow at 988messaging.org/research. That website is live right now. If you go to it, you'll see the findings from our previous study with populations disproportionately impacted by suicide. If you haven't read that study, I highly encourage you to do that now. And then the trusted messenger work that's coming out tomorrow will be a really great complement to a more holistic, community-based communications effort. And with that, I will turn it over to the main event, which is our primary investigator, Derek, to walk us through the research findings. Take it away, Derek.
Thank you so much. And hello, everybody. It's good to be with you again this afternoon. And I appreciate all of your hard work and what you are doing as well on this very important topic. And here at the Ad Council, it is one that is very near and dear to us as we continue to work on mental health and suicide prevention work as well. So this afternoon, my plan is just to walk you through some of the findings from this research report, which is a sequel to what we did earlier, as you heard. And our whole aim with this study is to try to understand individuals that are the closest to our populations who are disproportionately impacted by suicide, how they engage, support, or what are the resources they need to potentially look at encouraging, nudging that usage of 988 in their relationship. These are our loved ones, closest connections to our populations disproportionately impacted. So we'll first talk about the methodology, then I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about the experience of our trusted messengers. And then after that, we'll get into 988 awareness, and then we'll leave it with how we would message and communicate to these very, very important people in our populations that we're talking about disproportionately impacted. So on the next slide, we're going to go ahead and dive into some of our methodology. On the screen right now, you're going to see some background information related to the quantitative phase, but I want to step back in a second and give you a sense of the whole research project overall. So as Liz and Chris have mentioned, this is an extension, a sequel to the previous work that we did. Quick reminder, it was during that previous research project that we released that we heard that there are individuals in the lives of our populations who are disproportionately impacted by suicide that are also engaging as supporters and help and assistance during mental health challenges. And so we identified who those individuals were, and we started this next phase of work. We had 2 phases overall in the research work related to trusted messengers. The first phase was a qualitative phase, and that is not necessarily reported in today's discussion, but it is in the broader report overall. And during that qualitative phase, we had a chance to talk directly to individuals to give us a sense of messaging communication and also their experiences. We took all of our learnings, and if you remember, if any of you have attended last time, we allow our trusted messengers, our audience, people with lived experience, to help define and create the messages with us, not us creating it for them. So what we do is that we created messages, and in that first qualitative phase, we started to refine those and bring those into this quantitative phase, which I'll share with you later on. In this quantitative phase, we had a 15-minute online survey. The 3 languages offered, as you see towards the top. But keep in mind, in order to qualify, you had to be at least a close connection or a loved one to our populations there that are in the middle as well. We had a total of almost 13,000 individuals participating in this quantitative phase. So here we were able and lucky to be able to do a lot of segmentation and a lot of analysis. And of course, I can't go through it all here, but there is so much more in the report and toolkit that when you have a chance to download it, as Liz had talked about, you want to take particular attention to some of those segments. So today I'm broadly going to give you the overarching findings, but keep in mind that a lot of those sort of key findings based on ethnicity and other segments of the population, you'll be able to find in the report. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in as we look to the next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about, in this first area, around mental health experiences overall. On the next slide, we're going to get a little bit further into what our trusted messengers were experiencing. So as Liz mentioned, we here at the Ad Council look at who do we need to communicate to and through to encourage an audience as well, right? So in communications, it's our job to not only communicate directly to our target audience populations, in this case, populations who are disproportionately impacted by suicide, as we've previously talked about, but also to those around them, right? So we look at a holistic communications ecosystem, and how do we encourage people who are most trusted, their loved ones, close connections, close relationships, to encourage that usage of 988. So a trusted messenger holds that trust, that close connection and relationship. So if they were to communicate and support their sort of loved one or close connection by saying and communicating about 988, then this would be a great opportunity to communicate with them too. So one of the first things that we did in the study is to try to understand what they're recognizing overall or what they have experienced too. Our trusted messengers, and you'll see this in aggregate here, by and large, have told us that they can recognize the behavior changes that happen in their loved ones as well. You'll see that if you look towards the right-hand side of your screen, those sort of higher bars, it means that they have a pretty good sense of when there are shifts or changes in mental health state as well. And on the next slide, you're going to see this in a little bit differently in how we asked it, which is, have you actually experienced a mental health struggle with your loved one? And we're going to get into like, what was that like? And as you can see here, we actually had it a little bit split, but by and large, we had about half of the population, a little over half, that had experienced something with their close connection overall. So the good thing is that we're getting that firsthand lived experience too as well. On the next slide, we ask a little bit further about their experiences, and that is the actions that they took in that situation. What were the things they were doing? Because keep in mind, if I'm going to communicate to our trusted messengers, I have to understand their current knowledge, their current behaviors in that moment as well. And as you'll see here from left to right, much of the sort of support and helpfulness has been in around talking with them and being present, holding them, being around them, calling other close connections to be with them and support them too as well, which is very, very key. Now, obviously, there are certain other elements you're going to see here, and you'll point it out on the screen a little bit. If you'll notice these little pluses that are there, it means that over-index. It means it's higher for that population segment overall. And specifically, what we noticed, and let's just talk to them on the phone, we had more friends of our disproportionately impacted by suicide populations that were talking to them by phone by some of our other populations as well. What's also interesting, as you'll see in the far right, is that we had more siblings who would call on to other family members for support in that moment too. On the next slide, we're going to dive a little bit further into some of those actions I just wanted to give you a sense of what else did we ask about. And I want to sort of clarify, how do we come up with the options here? That's why we do that qualitative phase. So during the qualitative phase, we ask them open-ended to tell us about their experiences. And so everything that you see here that we asked about came directly from our trusted messengers in that previous research phase. But I just wanted to point out a few things here that were some slight differences, such as partners and spouses had called therapists or counselors more than our other populations, our designated trusted messengers. And they also called their physician a little bit more. But keep in mind, this is on the lower end of all the other actions, as you saw earlier. So far, here's what we kind of know, right? Our trusted messengers have about half of them had an experience during a mental health struggle or challenge. And most of their experience has been there to be supportive, talk with them, be present, hold and hug, and be there to that close and show support. On the next slide, you're going to see a little bit further around what would you take necessarily in the future. Now, you also see some holes there in the middle. I'll talk about those as well. But one of the things here that you're going to see is now that they've had that first experience, but what else would they do? Where else, if they had another experience, have they learned sort of situationally where they might be more of a support in different areas? And most of them talked about just being there and spending more time with them, getting to ensure that they know that they have a support that's there for them as well. The other thing is that we did see searching for online information too as well. But what was interesting is, and again, going back to our spouses and partners in that previous slide, is that you're going to see on the far right here that our spouses and partners told us they would contact more therapists and counselors in the future if there was another mental health struggle or challenge too. Now, you're going to see a few things here on contacting other close friends or other family members, and these are populations of mothers and caregivers, which is missing. And keep in mind, remember, the reason that we were not able to survey all mothers and caregivers is that we also had populations that were older, 49 plus rural men in there. So we could not access mothers given that age population. On the next slide, you're going to see this further explained just a little bit more. And you're going to see some nuances here. The previous slide showed you what they would probably do in the actions, but I just wanted to give you a sense of some other things we also heard, which is continue to talk to other family members, but also, again, spouses and partners, look in that middle category there, contacting a physician for guidance. So overall, the thematic that you're going to see about actions taken, desired actions taken in the future if experienced a mental health challenge or struggle with their loved one, our spouses and partners are turning to or would contact therapists, counselors from that perspective versus our other populations, our mothers, caregivers, siblings, or friends as well. On the next slide, we're going to dive a little bit further now into awareness. But before we do, just kind of keep in mind where we are so far. So half of our overall sample of 12,800 individuals had experienced, from a lived perspective, something of a mental health or struggle with their loved ones who are disproportionately impacted by suicide. We know that there are differences in the way of the reaction, but the primary support that they were doing in that moment was to be there, be supportive, hug, and so forth. But we also saw that it's our spouses and partners who are turning more for the future to therapists and counselors. So what we wanted to do next in the study is to understand trusted messengers awareness overall of 988. we're going to use this term aided awareness versus unaided. So in research, communications research, when somebody says aided, it means that we had a battery or a list of options to point out. Have you ever heard of any of these, right? And somebody can select it. When we say unaided, that means I'm just going to leave an open box and say, can you name a hotline or describe 988? So I'm going to point you to that little box right in the middle there. And that says 9% of the total trusted messengers could name 988 without any prompts. So that means that we got close to a 10% branded awareness without any support. And then if you actually see on the left-hand side, we had over 50% of our 12,800 folks who had actually aware of 988 in general, which is pretty good, which is really good. You'll see some on the other side. So it's about split 50-50 when it comes to awareness aided and unaided of 988. On the next slide, you're going to see a little bit further around sort of looking at 988 from the perspective of why they might call, right? So we wanted to understand from individuals why, after we started to describe 988, when and how and likely they would call overall. And as you'll see on the bottom left-hand side, a vast majority of our trusted messengers said that they would call 988 if they felt like they were going to harm themselves, but also to support and struggling with their own mental health. So it was interesting during the study, while the intention right there was to try to obviously talk about their loved one, they turned to themselves to also respond. And we heard this in the qual too, the qualitative phase, where they would say, you know, while I'm here to support my loved one and my connection, I also see 988 to support myself too as well. So we started to see that increase in usage. Now, there were some other things there, of course, that were sort of near the 70th percentile marks for some of our populations. That was things like talking to someone, feeling like the other individual or their loved one might harm themselves, or if they were needing resources overall. On the next slide, we'll dive a little bit further into some of the sort of reasons and barriers and elements. And this kind of comes into around associations, right? So one of the things we like to ask is, if I talk about 988, I'm going to describe it to you. And by the way, the description we used is the description that came from the previous research, right? So one of the key things, if you recall from the previous research, is that we tested how to talk about 988. And when we described it here, we said, when you hear about it now, for some of you who may or may not be aware, what do you think? What comes top of mind? And similarly, very similarly to our previous study, 24/7, it's free, it's helpful, it's anonymous, private, confidential. They can talk to someone. These are the same patterns of what we heard in our previous study overall. So keep that in mind. The same reasons why our populations disproportionately impacted by suicide told us they would likely use the service is the same reasons our loved ones to those same populations would use it too as well. So this is a key communications piece, highlighting those benefits of 24/7, free, accessible, someone who's going to listen, all key elements in the communications traits and aspects to highlight. In the next slide, we'll dive a little bit further with this, right? So I'm going to give you the further all the way. We asked all kinds of different questions, right? And part of this is to try to understand where some of the other responses come in. Keep in mind, all the responses came from our qualitative phase. And so we did give a balance. We tried to give a balance of saying, well, I would call in or not call in or use potentially. And so you can kind of see some of the other aspects here as well. But one of the things that I thought was interesting and intriguing is look at your left-hand side. And the reason I incorporated this slide here, referring the individual to other mental health professionals, while it was a little higher for our spouses and partners, keep that in your head from our previous discussion, it is still quite low as compared to all the other reasons why they would call in. So mental health professionals a referral was not top of mind, even though that was top for our spouses and partners and other reasons that they would do for a future mental health challenge. All right, next slide. We're going to dive further a little bit into this familiarity, right? And so when we do the familiarity and awareness, we ask about value. What would make it more valuable, right? Why would you be more why we think about it in the word incentivized, but it's more about value in this sense. What would 988 be able to have that would make you be more attracted to potentially using it or referring it or recommending it as well? And so first thing is you'll see towards the bottom, we've got about 3 or 4 responses that are hovering very closely together. Now, these are important because from a communication standpoint, these are the key pieces that you would really, really want to highlight in your elements that you're having out there marketing and communicating to trusted messengers. First, we heard this a lot in the qual and now in the quant. And that is our trusted messengers really want to know what happens during that call, that text, or that chat, because they were telling us in the qual and now in this quant, I want to understand if I'm referring, if I'm nudging, if I'm encouraging my loved one to use 988, I want to be assured I know what happens. So a key element is helping our trusted messengers understand what happens during that call, being descriptive about it, helping them understand what happens when they call in, during the call, and then what happens after too as well. They'd love to know that information is confidential because I think that's important. And hearing personal stories of success is really key for them. That would help them be reassured too as well. Of course, similarly to our previous study, knowing that they're trained counselors is important. Seeing advertisements, of course, is good out there because it's more real, it's present as well, so they could encourage it if it's already been heard out there in the community. So by and large, what's really key here is our trusted messengers want confidence in their recommendation to use 988. That confidence comes from understanding what happens during conversations, chat, text, call with 988 overall. Next slide, I dive a little bit further into this on the sort of value piece here. And I wanted to show you the opposite end here. And that is, we often think if it's featured in the news or if it's endorsed by someone, that might be important too as well. That isn't as important as some of the other pieces, is that directly seeing it out and present, but also showcasing the different ways in which that it's been used by others. So very, very key. All right, next slide. We're going to dive further into some of this awareness elements by asking, okay, what resources do you need that for 988 on the website? And as you can see, this was a select all. We gathered all of the pieces that you see on the bottom row from our qualitative, from our trusted messengers. And as you're going to note here, a lot of this information just helps them be reassured, building that confidence. But also, we heard this so much in our qualitative, and that is, I just want to know what I should be doing in that moment when my loved one and my close connection is having a struggle or a challenge with their mental health. I just may not know what to do, or even having suicidal thoughts. And so it was about building the support and the confidence to help and support their loved one. They just wanted to make sure that whatever they do is the right thing. And so as you'll see here, information on who to contact, how to start a conversation with their loved one, how to identify. This was a key piece that kept coming up, which is, I know when something is changing in their behavior, but I don't know if it's something serious or not. That was something we heard a lot in our qualitative. And of course, other elements like what to do during a panic attack, or if I was to go down the route of a mental health therapist and so forth too as well. But again, look at that second to last one on the bottom. Real life examples of people who have been helped or used 988. Can't reinforce enough. The more you share about an experience. Now, of course, I know we can't use actual names and so forth, but just stories of individuals and the experience is key. All right, on this next slide, we'll dive a little bit further into sort of this piece here, and that is just some more information. We asked a full battery. And as you can see towards the bottom pieces, the least, it's still at 40 and 50% were links to religious services as compared to, say, things like stress management and so forth. Apps is in the second category there on your left. It wasn't the top. It was sort of middle of the road as compared to others. Now, one thing to note, and if you followed along with any of our studies in the last time, is that we have been talking about our older rural men 49 plus. Overall, trusted messengers, loved ones, connections to that population are less likely to find information helpful on any things related to things like relaxation or health, wellness, or meditation. They did find the other resources, like direct resources of what happens and so forth, to build confidence. But any of the sort of health, wellness related meditation elements that were talked about in the qualitative, they did not find least likely information that they would support or utilize in general. All right, next slide. So now, if we kind of track where we've been, right? So we want to talk a little bit about the future intentions now that they know more about 988. And at the same time, we're going to talk a little bit further about some aspects and some barriers here in this section. But so far, right, what we know is that our population has been experiencing mental health challenges with their loved ones. Our spouses and partners are kind of turning a little bit more towards those counselors and therapists. We saw that one of the key things is that 24/7 free, a lot of the attributes of our population in our last study that they would utilize 988 is the same here. But one of the key things that our trusted messengers need is confidence in knowing what's going to happen during that conversation with 988. So that brings us now to this a little bit further in future intentions. And on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about people just who are open to using 988. So one of the things that we like to do is segment from populations that will utilize 988 and others that said they would likely not. If you're curious, it was about 8,800 of the total 12,800 that said to us, I would likely utilize 988 or I'm open to utilizing it. So it was a pretty good overall population. And as you'll see here, there are some things that they sort of came up with, but these are folks that are most interested, not just everybody overall. And so I want to point you to that little box right in the middle. More siblings of our white population, because we also incorporated whites as a comparison group. And people have experienced suicidal ideation, said they'd be open to 988 because they can't support their loved ones alone. Fewer mothers. Of course, we saw that we're a little bit had differences compared to our trusted messengers too as well, said that they'd use 988 to learn more about mental health in general. But by and large, much of this is to learn about situational engagement, meaning how should I go about mental health situations overall? Next slide. And on this slide, you're going to see a little bit further information on barriers. So now this is to individuals. It's about 2,400. We just want to ask them in particular, okay, why wouldn't you use it at all? Right? That really helps us understand the opposite end of this. And as you'll see here, one of the key reasons is overstepping one's connection that they have. It really is. They feel like they could really damage the relationship. Now you're going to notice, do you see that bar? In each of these, there's that little plus sign. Just scan across there. You see those plus signs? It's all in that last bar. That's our friend group. Our friends are the most concerned about overstepping that connection that they have, that trusted relationship, and they're really worried about damaging it. So that would have to be addressed in communications. Where interestingly enough, mothers were the least worried. And you'll see that also is that they were the least worried mothers were about the law enforcement piece too. So by and large, what's a key piece here is friends are hesitant on that recommendation for 988 because of overstepping that connection. So individuals who are not interested, that main reason is about overstepping and damaging relationship. Next slide. And in this one, I just wanted to share with you some additional barriers that we heard in the qualitative, but didn't really come out strong here as well. And that is things like it might cost them money. You know, for instance, if somebody was going to find out, worried they call connections parents, don't know if it'd be talking to a real person, was still pretty low. All right, on the next slide. On this slide, you're going to see a little bit about building confidence. Remember, I talked earlier that we have to help our trusted messengers be assured as they continue to nudge their loved ones and support as they connect with them. And there were some additional things that we heard here, such as knowing what happens during the conversation, again, privacy, and understanding what's an emergency or not, or where it is, because our trusted messengers told us in the qualitative that I may not know specific things that are going on that is harmful or not harmful, or what I should be doing. You know, obviously encouraging 988 regardless is really key there. Next slide. And on this one, I just wanted to showcase, this is my circle slide, lots of circles here, but there's a couple of key things. I just wanted to give you one aspect of a race ethnicity breakdown overall. Now, keep in mind, in the report, there is a lot of this breakdowns. I'm sharing just the aggregate so we can get through all of it. And I shared a few pop-outs here and there, but in essence, I wanted to give you a sense that, you know, at the end, we asked them, would they contact 988 now that you've heard so much about it? And we haven't even gotten to the messaging yet. And you can see here, if you'll notice the pink bar, versus the others in the circle, almost without a doubt, across all the segments, we saw increases in a likely state from 78th percentiles all the way across, no matter how we spliced and diced the data. We saw increases of nearly 20% in likelihood to use 988 after they had a chance to understand what it was and the offerings. Just look across each of these from the top and then go down. The top shows the pre, when we asked them at the beginning of the survey if they've ever used 988, versus now after learning about it. And we saw 20%, and if not more in certain categories, even higher, especially in our AI/AN category overall. That was even about 30%. So really, really good indications based upon messaging. All right. So that starts to bring us closer to our messaging piece. So now we've got our good barriers. We kind of understand some of the challenges, why people wouldn't, right? So we know that our friends are worried about damaging that relationship. Mothers, not as much so. We also know that from some of our other reasons too, that it's about helping and supportive. And also it would make more value if they understood exactly what happened during that conversation. So to this point in the discussions and interviews in the quantitative phase, we now get into the messaging. So keep in mind, let me give you some background again on message frame review that we did last time and that we replicated here. So what we did is that at the end of our last research project, we had a set of messages in the toolkits that some of you may have accessed. And it was during that time that we took the messages that were optimized after our final round of quantitative, and then we adapted those for trusted messengers. So that was the foundation for the first round of message testing. So we took the previous final optimized versions directly from our disproportionately impacted by suicide populations, what they told us that was good or bad. And then we optimized those and converted them into messages that were used by trusted messengers. We then put that first round in front of our trusted messengers in the qualitative phase. And during the qualitative phase, we got feedback. And then it was updated again based upon their feedback overall. So what I'm about to show you is the response by our trusted messengers, the 12,000 population. But it's a response, to the messages developed by trusted messengers, developed from our populations disproportionately impacted by suicide. So as throughout all of this project, what was very key is that messaging comes directly and developed and optimized by our audiences, those with lived experience, people that are disproportionately impacted and their loved ones, not us per se on the research side. So on this first slide here, of course, we don't have enough time to read through all of this, but I want to give you a sense of the elements that we have here. And as in our last research, we start with a foundational frame. What that foundational frame is the basis for describing 988 to trusted messengers. Then we also have some conditional frames too as well. This is the foundational frame. And again, we won't have time to read through it. You'll have a chance to look at it in the report in the toolkit. Next slide. On this piece here, we asked them, based upon the foundational frame, what did you like? Was it helpful? Was it informative overall? And look towards the right-hand side. Overall, the way we describe 988 was very, very informative for them and really helpful. Now, a word of caution, and this population comes back up here as well. Same from our previous rounds of research. Older rural men, 49 plus, trusted messengers were less likely to choose extremely helpful. And friends of Black Americans, as well as loved ones and close connections, were least likely to say somewhat helpful. So there was just some slight differences. But overall, it was very, very informative. Next slide shows you just how motivated they would be to recommend overall. And in fact, we actually saw that recommendation come higher from our AA-NHPI populations, trusted messengers versus some of the others. But by and large, all of it was extremely likely to recommend 988 to their loved ones. So we know that foundational frame, the way that we describe it, is in a good route and something you should start to use and incorporate. Next slide. On this slide, I'm going to give you a little bit of how things performed. Okay, so if you remember this from the last time, I want to start you in the bottom right-hand corner. If you go down there, there's this 2 lines. 5% liked nothing, 50% disliked nothing. So what that means is that we had 6,400 people that basically said, I kind of like how it is right here. It's good. I wouldn't change a thing. That's 50, that's pretty good, honestly, from a messaging perspective. For any of you that work on messaging, that's not bad. We had 5% overall that liked nothing. The whole thing's bad. But by and large, 50% is good. Then what we did is that, as last time, similar, right? We allowed them to like something, comment that something was polarizing, or comment that something was disliked, right? And so what happened is that they could go through and put a little thumbs up, thumbs down, or they didn't like it as polarizing. And as you can see here, and I'm going to read the likes out because I think you're going to find something similar to what we heard in the other piece. What I could do to support her, how she could speak with someone who could actually relate, who could provide help. To help her feel better, for her, 988 was a much needed first step to feel heard and help and share what's going on. Compassion, right? So they'll get one-on-one support, compassionate counselors, 24/7, all conversations are confidential. All of that coming directly from our trusted messenger were the like. If you recall from our previous study, it's about the same. It really is about the same. And there were some elements that were sort of disliked, and you'll see those in the red. And much of those disliked, as we went into it, it was because it was too situational, meaning that that was particular to this story, but not particular to their experiences overall as well. Now, we've optimized that in the toolkit, so you want to take a look at how we've reframed it too as well. On the next slide, you're going to see here a foundational frame call to action. So we asked them, now that you've read this, and the vast majority really liked it, what would you do? And what we heard is I would tell my loved one, my close connection, what was going on and to use 988, which is really great. In the 80th percentiles across the board, they would share information. They themselves would visit 988 and then contact it if they were worried about their loved one on their behalf. So really good CTAs, call to actions, as we say. So that's really positive in terms of utilizing those with the message frames. On the next slide, we're going to dive deeper into what we call conditional frames. And if you recall this in our last study, we had a couple pieces that we wanted to dive deeper into because we either heard they were bigger barriers or challenges. So we call them conditional frames. Those are elements that we message to because we know that they keep popping up a lot in our qualitative and our other research. In this case, in our trusted messengers research, we had 2 of those. One of them is called "You're Not Alone." One of the elements that we heard from our trusted messengers is that they felt they didn't know if this is common. The experiences that they were experiencing with their loved one, is that the norm or not? So we talked about creating a frame that just talks about "you're not alone." Second thing that we heard is, I just don't feel confident to know when things are in crisis. Identifying that crisis is very, very key. So we developed 2 frames, one to address that notion of, I don't know if I'm the only one experiencing this with my loved one. And the second one is about how to identify crisis. But you're going to note that we didn't necessarily go down the route in identifying crisis in saying, here's the 5 tips to identify crisis, but rather to say, call or text or chat with 988, and they'll help you identify crisis as well. So there was a nuance that we had in that piece. So on the next slide, we're going to dive deeper into how each of them performed. The conditional frames, we heard that when we talked about being not alone, it was very, very positive. It was really good to hear from their perspective that what they witnessed or experienced with their loved one is not uncommon per se, and that they're not the only ones that have experienced something like this too as well. And most of it was too is to try to understand the situation of mental health within their loved one. In fact, actually, we found that spouses of our AANHPI population, their loved ones, that they actually said that you're not alone was even better than on a foundational frame as compared to some of our other populations. On the next slide, you're going to see how our identifying crisis piece performed. And that one performed quite well too. In fact, we also heard, a little bit some differences by siblings. In fact, they would tell us that if they've experienced a suicidal ideation, they said that the identifying crisis wasn't important for them because that experience was known. But 2 things are key here. Both frames, all 3 frames are foundational frame, which is the basis for describing 988, and our 2 specific conditional frames. You're not alone, and identifying crisis did really well. And given the situations, we would look at it and say, in a segmented communications plan where you might lead with foundational frame of what is 988, the benefits and opportunities or the features of 988 and why you should potentially consider using it. And then looking at, we have certain populations potentially that look at identifying crisis, or in this case, also you're not alone, might be a good place to then continue messaging on as well. On the next slide, you're going to see a little bit of this sort of recommendation piece again, right? So we asked them, after reading the conditional frames, are you now more likely to recommend 988 versus others? You're not alone actually performed better than the identifying crisis one. So that one definitely was more persuasive overall than the others. And in this case, though, in the identifying crisis, we would say this might be a good sub-narrative to use, but may not be the strong one to pull a reaction or an outcome from a call to action, like text or chat 988. Now, I have to say that there was a little bit of a difference when it came to our population we often talk about in this, which is our friends and connections to older rural men, 49 plus. We actually had that population choose. So friends of older rural men, 49 plus, chose the crisis one more than the aggregates as well. So it was kind of interesting compared to all the other groups. That was one note. So the identifying crisis one for our friends, close connections, more for our older men, rural 49 plus. Next slide, please. So let me sort of finish here with some key recommendations. The first one is being on the next slide here. And this really dives just, reinforcing what we heard in defining crisis and ideation and essentially trying to understand what we heard. And on the right-hand side, I did put some subpopulation segments there for you to take a look at. But I just wanted to reinforce. It's about 1/2 of our population had experienced a mental health situation, crisis, or challenge with their loved ones. So this population, the individuals we had in the study, definitely give us that perception and understanding overall. And the majority said that they could recognize shifts or changes in behaviors in general. Again, on the right-hand side, I give you a few just sort of call outs in case you didn't want to go diving deep into the report, which is things like people with suicidal ideation, people with disabilities, and people who identify as LGBTQIA+ to us tend to have poor mental health, as we've seen in other instances as well. All right. Next slide talks a little bit further about that experience, right? Remember, when they're with their loved one, it's being in close contact, holding them, talking with them, conversing with them. And they said in the future, though, that might shift a little bit, just given their experiences, and that some would contact a therapist, especially maybe loved ones and spouses too as well. and or seek outside resources in general. The right-hand side, you'll see a few of those differentiators, including our trusted message of older rural men that I've been talking about too. Next slide talks a little bit further about that experience, and which is that, much of the trusted messengers that we had talked to, that sort of experience that they had in the actions overall, they continue to look at going forward and saying to us, as much as I can do to help and support them is what I would want to do and recommend, and I will be there for them. Just showing them the behavior that I'm here for them is really, really key. Next slide. On this next one here, I just want to talk a little bit further around, or just remind you of the 988 usage, which is really wonderful, honestly. Awareness, on that awareness side, keep in mind, we had about 9% unaided, just wrote 988 into a text box, right? So it'd be great to benchmark that in the future and see how it grows. But all in all, once we started to talk about 988, the interest level increased dramatically. And you'll see that on the next slide too, when we start getting into some of our 988 overall familiarity, right? So we actually had individuals, who would tell us that they're familiar with it. They didn't have a strong grasp of it, but they understood the concept and heard the concept was out there in some way. And keep in mind, this same traits and reasons about 24/7 being free, availability, all of those pieces were important. And of course, confidentiality, those same pieces that we heard in the previous study. All right, next slide. We'll talk a little bit about the value, right? Remember, I mentioned it's important that when you're thinking about trusted messengers, what they're looking for is, tell me about the situation. I need conversation starters. I want to support. I want to help and encourage usage, but I don't necessarily know what happens. So I would love to know those personal testimonials, know more about the trained counselors, and also just know about how to have this conversation with my loved one too. Not just in the moment of a crisis, but also at other times as well. The next slide talks a little bit about the resources that are there, which is essentially, we talked about those resources being, show me, tell me, help me understand how it works. But on the other side, the barriers were quite there in that, remember, our friends, the friends trusted messenger category had the biggest barrier around breaching that confidentiality, that support, that loved one overall. And that was really, really hard to, that is one of their major reasons why they would not recommend 988. And on the next slide, you're going to see a little bit further around that close connection, right? In meaning that when they're trained professionals, what does that look like, right? They don't want to damage the relationship. So showing stories and experiences where that didn't happen is really, really key. And also the information that, not only what happens, but those counselors' experiences would be helpful too. On the next slide, we'll talk about those messaging and we'll round it out here, right? The foundational frame, we couldn't believe it. Over 3/4 said that the way we were defining and describing 988 encouraged them to potentially use it in the future, which is fantastic. And you should hopefully lift some of that communication into the way that you define and describe 988 as well. And on the next slide, we talk a little bit further around, that wording and the tweaks that worked. And it was really the language that we heard from the previous time, 24/7, confidentiality, someone relatable, acknowledging, and being heard, being listened to are all key pieces overall. They disliked some of the signs and symptoms and challenges that we described in the situation. So we would just go right into focusing on the language of the lifeline, of course, rather than necessarily going in the story that way. And then, of course, our conditional frames. Remember that you're not alone versus identifying crisis. The you're not alone was the more inspirational one for them, just knowing that their experiences, this is sort of the destigmatizing environment too as well. So that knowing that there's loved ones and other people out there having these similar experiences too. And as you'll see on this final slides here, when we're thinking about that awareness and familiarity, I would just say a couple things around sort of what I would recommend for you. And that would be is just let trusted messengers know that they're not alone. Their loved ones who are experiencing mental health challenges are not alone either. And just to reassure the confidentiality, what goes on in the process of when a person calls in, that process overall, the information, what's involved is very, very key. the more resources you can support and build that confidence, the more we'll see some of that usage increase too as well. And I'd lastly say on the next slide, on some of these final recommendations is, you know, it's always good when you're thinking about tangible things you might want to communicate out or have at the ready. That would be, who do you contact? Maybe some conversation starters to bridge that gap, including ways to identify signs of, you know, while our trusted messengers said they're confident, they also said it would be great to know if that's right? That confidence in general, and including mental health conditions that we discussed earlier. On the next slide, talks a little bit further around this, but you know, it's a lot of words here, but I would just say this is that our rural older men, similar to our last study, we do see differences in the trusted messengers and the loved ones. And we have to recognize that in that population so far as being, you know, directly not only communicating to them, but also having other on the ground resources, direct communication, one-on-one style conversations is a recommendation too. All right. I just want to say thank you for the chance to present, and I'm going to turn it back over to my colleagues here, and I think we're going to head into our Q&A section. Liz?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much, Derek. That was fantastic. And a tremendous thanks also to Carissa and the team at SAMHSA, Shelby and her team at SPRC, and of course the TTAC for having us on here today. And also to everybody who was able to join us. Thank you for all the work that you do every single day. Before we get into Q&A, I know we're at the top of the hour, but just a reminder that all of the research materials, the report, the toolkit, all of these will be available tomorrow at the URL that you see linked in the QR code on your screen right now. If you work with any communicators who weren't able to make this webinar, please share the materials with them. And again, thank you all for being here.